أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
السلام عليكم.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له هو الأحد هو الأول والآخر، هو الظاهر والباطن، لا شريك له. ونشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله، ونصلي ونسلم ونبارك على الحبيب المصطفى محمد النبي الأمين المرسل رحمة للعالمين، خاتم الرسل والأنبياء أجمعين، وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين، وعلى أصحابه المختارين. سبحان الله، لا إله إلا هو، نؤمن به ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستجيره ونستنصره، فإنه حقا من هدى الله فلا مضل له، ومن يضلله لا هادي له. اللهم يا رب العالمين، يا علي يا عظيم، اللهم إنا نبتهل إليك وندعوك أن تصلح لنا ديننا الذي هو عصمة أمرنا، وأن تصلح لنا دنيانا التي فيها معاشنا، وأن تصلح لنا آخرتنا التي فيها معادنا، وأن تجعل الحياة زيادة لنا في كل خير، وأن تجعل الموت راحة لنا من كل شر، لا إله إلا أنت. As I was preparing for this khutbah, I was struck. It's not unusual, but perhaps this week it was just particularly striking how many issues one can pick to focus on. So many incidents and events, unfoldings, occurrences, things that are in every direct and unmitigated way is relevant to Muslims, and things that are relevant but perhaps in an indirect way. Thus, just the sheer volume. And when one is confronted by so many grand issues that drown the consciousness and overwhelm the intellect, I often escape to micro-level events that often act as a handle by which one can unpack and unravel the much larger events that surround us in the world. This week, what caught my attention is something that perhaps only Arabic speakers would be aware of, or not even Arabic speakers, it just might be not even all Egyptians, but perhaps a segment of the Egyptian population. But it is telling and revealing in so many ways, and it deserves pause, and it deserves reflection. And it deserves reflection as to also what it tells us about all the other numerous grand, giant issues that confront us in the world. The event that I'm speaking about, there's an Egyptian woman who 30 years ago was granted asylum in the Netherlands. This woman, her name is Metwaly. Metwaly was born a Muslim, was raised a Muslim in Egypt. Interestingly, her father worked as a police officer in the Egyptian state. Egyptian state is plagued with injustices and oppression, and one can only imagine what a police officer serving that oppressive state might become involved with. Nevertheless, according to Metwaly's testimony, she recalls her father reciting the Quran at dawn, that she would wake up to the voice of her father reciting the Quran. At some point, Metwaly, who did not grow up as a practicing Muslim, she considered herself a Muslim because her family is Muslim, and she believed that her loyalties are with Islam because that's what she was raised in. But notably, she worked initially as a teacher and then a school administrator. And as a school administrator, for reasons that perhaps she herself doesn't understand, she was intolerant of Christian students. She was intolerant of students who were not Muslim, although herself, she was not a practicing Muslim, but that's the way she understood herself. And by her own testimony, she would sometimes discriminate against Christian students, pick on them, make their lives difficult for no good reason other than the lack of generosity in her own soul. Anyway, Metwaly then falls gravely ill, and when she fell gravely ill, she was visited by an image, a vision. In this vision, she saw, again by her own testimony and her own writings, she saw what she described as a very beautiful human being. This human being had blue eyes and was white, a very white complexion, hair that leaned towards the blondish color, sort of blondish hair. Not quite blonde, but blondish. And in this vision, this beautiful man told Nahid Metwaly to come to him. And after this vision, Nahid Metwaly believed that what she saw was Jesus Christ. Jesus had manifested to her. Because of this vision, Nahid Metwaly converted to Christianity. After converting to Christianity, she, of course, at the time, the mother, I believe, of 4 children, this threw the entire family into turbulence. She believed or claimed that she was being persecuted by the Egyptian state. Who knows? The Egyptian state persecutes everyone that shows any type of independence of thought or independence of conscience. Whether you're a Muslim or Christian hardly seems to matter. In many ways, the Egyptian state is an equal opportunity persecutor. But as does happen with so many Christians in the Muslim world who complain of persecution, complain that they are being targeted, whether fairly or not, meaning whether in fact they are being targeted or they're making it up. As often happens with so many Christians that claim persecution, and has been taking place at least since the age of colonialism, she found the arms of Western countries open to her. Unlike Muslims who are persecuted for their Muslim beliefs, unlike Muslims who, for instance, diligently work to try to transition their own nations to a democracy, but do it from an Islamic foundation, many of these people perish in prisons and never have a chance in hell of getting asylum. But since the age of colonialism, the West has self-appointed itself, despite all the West's ideological jargon about secularism. But the West has appointed itself as the caretaker, the de facto sovereign over Christians in Muslim lands, as we see in Lebanon or Syria or Iraq or Egypt. So Nahid Metwaly finds it fairly easy. There's very little difficulty for her to leave Egypt, unlike so many Muslim scholars and Muslim activists who are persecuted and banned from leaving their country, and banned for 10 years, 20 years, like the Qatari, the Khasraji that we've talked about in past khutbahs, who is now banned from leaving Qatar for at least 10 years, and also banned from any access to social media. So Nahid Metwaly is granted asylum in the Netherlands. Now, the next thing we know is that Nahid Metwaly becomes a regular star in numerous videos and shows and numerous media outlets. Her consistent role is someone that comes on these forums to trash Islam. She becomes literally a full-time professional Islamophobe. She trashes everything. She trashes the Quran, she trashes the Prophet ﷺ, she trashes Islamic values, she trashes Islamic culture, she mocks the Prophet, she even at times says things that are obscene about the Prophet and about the Quran. She is everywhere in this persona. She even becomes in the 90s famous or infamous as the constant host of a notorious character. The name of this guy escapes me, and I think my mind just doesn't want to remember his name. But this is a Coptic priest who lives in Canada or the United States, who has made a career of being a full-time Islamic basher. This priest, all he does for the past some 40 years is that he appears on television shows and bashes the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, mocks the Quran, slanders Muslims, and Nahid Metwaly became his partner on literally hundreds of shows. Now, all of this is well known, and for those of us who encountered these channels, know the hurtful bite of insults and mocking and jeering, and often a sting that even feels racist in its haughtiness and its entitlement and its air of superiority. It is as if this former Muslim, speaking about the people who remain Muslim, is speaking to them as if they are some inferior race, doomed by the very genes of Islam to being backward, being ignorant, being irrational, etc., etc. Well, what transpired recently is after 30 years of bashing Islam, Nahid Metwaly, after now she is 80 or 81 years old or 82, something like that, in her 80s, it comes out that she has now converted back to Islam. And she posts a number of videos apologizing to Muslims for mocking them, insulting them, slandering them for 30 years. Immediately when she announces that she is now a Muslim again, and in those videos, Nahid Metwaly speaks about that she had speaks about the process of transformation back to Islam. But of course, what catches your attention is that the minute that she announces that she is returning to Islam, there is a flood of slanderous material by Christian evangelists and Christian fanatics about how Nahid Metwaly is mentally ill, that she is unstable, that she is crazy, that she is insane. They even go as far as finding her youngest daughter, who is with her in the Netherlands. Of course, she's a married woman with her own children. But they go as far as enlisting her youngest daughter in defaming her mother, in coming out and saying, my mother has lost her mind, she is crazy. It is because of her mental instability that she has returned to Islam, etc., etc. But what caught my attention is a number of things that really warrant reflection. Now that Nahid Metwaly is testifying and speaking about her experience after converting to Christianity, we discover something that is persistent and pervasive in our modern world. That the very same nations that insist that we live in a post-religious world, the very same nations that preach to the world that religion doesn't matter to them anymore, that they are neutral towards religion, those very same nations open their doors wide to Nahid Metwaly and have a long pattern and a long history of doing so. To put it even more directly, it becomes very clear by Nahid Metwaly's own testimony that once she announced that she is a convert to Christianity, obtaining visas to practically all the countries of the world became no obstacle. Nahid Metwaly testifies as to how, after converting to Christianity and leaving Egypt, she was able to travel all around the world. She never had any difficulty in getting a visa to come to the United States or Canada or France or Switzerland, or for that matter, any country in South America or any country in Africa or any country in Asia. She stepped in a world in which access is not a problem. Second, in this same world that is ostensibly secular and post-religious, Nahid Metwaly's list of dignitaries and people occupying important positions in their own governments who met with her or who welcomed her or who greeted her is truly dizzying. She converted to Christianity, and suddenly she is flying all over the world, meeting figures that one only reads about in news reports. Third, you learn from Nahid Metwaly's own testimony that for 30 years, if she so desired, she could be busy every day of the week. In other words, she was booked solid. She was being invited, not just by churches, not just by student organizations, not just by think tanks, but she was being invited by literally dozens and dozens of organizations from all over the post-religious secular world. And she did, for 30 years, all she did in these invitations is to go and bash Islam, to time and time again testify as to how beautiful the vision of Jesus was and how false Islam is. And there was nothing more. It never got old. It never got boring. It never got redundant. For 30 years, she would fly from one place to the other, including interviews with some of the top media outlets, top journals, top newspapers, meeting dignitaries, giving the same lectures over and over, television shows, radio shows. Fifth, since converting to Christianity, she never held a paying job. Her full-time job became an Islam basher. She made tons of money from royalties paid for appearing in these interviews and lectures as a professional Islam basher. She never had to hold a job, seek employment, receive social welfare, none of it. She was taken care of financially. And taken care of to the point that even in her old age today, early 80s, money is not a problem. She has enough saved to be taken care of for the rest of her life. Money that was earned from being a professional Islam basher. 6, and one of the most astounding things is that at the time Nahid Metwaly was doing what we know people like Wafa Sultan or Noni Darwish or Hirchi Ali are doing, a number of books, some 20 books appeared with Nahid Metwaly's name on them. I remember very well one of these books. The book had an extremely learned air to it. It was published in France. It was translated to 7 languages. The book was about pre-Islamic poetry and the Quran. الشعر الجاهلي والقرآن. And the book argued that the similarities between the Quran and pre-Islamic poetry are overwhelming and undeniable, so that the Quran in its proper historical literary setting is nothing exceptional at all. And in fact, according to this book, the Quran plagiarized pre-Islamic poetry. The book was devastating to read because it had hundreds of footnotes. And as I said, it had the air of great learning. And even one of my graduate students, I learned, sadly, that this graduate student, members of his own family who had the misfortune of encountering this book, lost faith in their religion. And they told him, the book is irrefutable. Don't you see? It's very obvious. The only problem about this book is that a lot of what it calls pre-Islamic poetry is fabricated, is invented. But you need to have a great deal of learning to know that this is fabricated poetry. Because someone with great command of Arabic fabricated this poetry. And even some of what the book claims are Quranic passages are also fabricated. And that's a matter of just laziness, because it needs a reader who actually checks whether the Quran does say what the book says it says, or has the Quran memorized. But if you don't have either, then it's very easy to get blown away by this book. And this is just one of the books attributed to Nahid Metwaly. But Nahid Metwaly, after then now returning to Islam, tells the world that in fact, out of the 20 books, she only wrote one or two. There's one, like a booklet, that doesn't count, it's not worth it. But the only one that she actually wrote is one where she talks about her Jesus vision. And as to all the other books, groups that she was in contact with wrote these books and came to her and said, "We'll give you money if you allow us to publish this book in your name, because we want the credibility of someone who used to be a Muslim, who people would believe has Arabic expertise, to be the author of the book." And sadly, Nahid Metwaly, apparently her Christian ethics didn't forbid her from doing so, but she would accept the money and agree. And the books were published in her name. And I can tell you that in their heyday, so much of the Islamophobia industry and so much of the Islamophobic propaganda and so much of the rhetoric that you hear from so-called former Muslims is stuff that was published in the 90s, found in Nahid Metwaly's books and books like Nahid Metwaly's. If you're just a kid that hardly out of college or in college, and you hear someone like Nahid Metwaly lecture, and especially if the lecture is written for her, citing things like the stuff you encounter in these books that seem to cite historical data, literary data, philosophical sources, etc., and you are sitting there basking in ignorance, overwhelmed, and say, "Oh my God, I'm having a crisis of faith." So after all these years, 30 years, Nahid Metwaly's conscience finally wakes up. And according to Nahid Metwaly herself, why? Because she feels she's nearing death. And she's scared. And when she got scared, and here is a real doozy. When she got scared, she read the Bible for the first time. She read the Bible for the first time. And when she read the Bible for the first time, she realized that this cannot be the truth. That this is mythology, not religion. And she has many valid intellectual points as to what she found so troubling in the Bible. And she herself knew that so much of the stuff that she was parroting about the Prophet and about the Quran is false. And she knew it was false. And she knew where she is going after she dies. And then she said, "God, forgive me. please forgive my entire past. And she came out in a number of videos apologizing to Muslims, confessing her sins, and saying, I know that through me, tens, if not hundreds or thousands of Muslims were misled away from their faith through my lies and my fabrications, and I am sorry. And I want you to know that they were lies and fabrications. The same world that welcomed Nahid Metwaly 30 years ago and opened doors for her all over the world is now on holy war, waging holy war against Nahid Metwaly, describing her as insane, mentally unstable. But I listened very carefully to this so-called mentally unstable woman. And some of the points that she makes as to why, when she read the Bible for the first time, she realized this cannot be true, are points that even surprised me. For instance, here is one of her points, this crazy, insane woman. In case you guys don't know, one of the chapters of the Bible is called Acts, or in Arabic, A'mal al-Rusul. Acts has a narrative that includes when Jesus is supposedly crucified, dies, is resurrected, comes after resurrection, meets with his disciples, and leaves with his disciples his final will and testament. In fact, it is this, that meeting between Jesus after resurrection and his apostles, including James, and what Jesus tells the apostles is a cornerstone of the very theology of priesthood in Christianity. But one of the points that Nahid Metwaly makes is that in Acts, when after the resurrection, the disciples of Jesus receive his last will and testament, Nahid Metwaly notes that in this will and testament, there's nothing about the crucifixion, about Jesus being the Son of God, or Jesus being a deity, or indeed about the resurrection itself. The will and testament is as follows. Acts 19, or Acts 15, verse 19. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. The Gentiles are the non-Jews. So we should not make it difficult for non-Jews who want to believe in Christ. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. For the law of Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times and is read in the synagogues on every Sabbath. So the last will and testament of Jesus to his disciples as to what they should treat, what they should teach the Gentiles. Don't worship idols. Actually, in the original, it doesn't say sexual immorality. It says adultery, zina. Do not commit adultery or fornicate. Do not eat strangled animals, and do not consume blood. And that's it. And then Metwaly says, lo and behold, this is exactly what the Quran says. This is the law of Moses, the law of Muhammad, and the law of Jesus. And how could it be that what the disciples are told is at the heart and core of what the Gentiles must learn is this, and nothing about the Trinity or the deity or the divinity of Jesus, nothing about any of what emerges long after Jesus dies. Nan Metwaly also points out that after Jesus dies, for 30 years, nothing emerges. 30 years, nothing emerges about the crucifixion of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus. For 30 years, this is according to Christian history, the disciples of Jesus are completely silent about anything that has to do with the supposed divinity of Jesus or the resurrection or indeed the crucifixion itself. And it is only after those 30 years that we start getting texts that are arguably, but indeed, as we see throughout the Bible, Jesus is always teaching and preaching that worship is due to his Father, and that the Father is greater than himself, and that the Father knows and he doesn't know. Doesn't sound like a crazy person, does it? Doesn't sound like the musings of an insane person. But what catches your attention is something that is verified by what I have experienced. So many of those people who either convert to Christianity or who indeed follow the Christian faith have never read the Bible. In fact, all they know about the Bible are little excerpts, what their churches have cut out of the Bible and given to them in little excerpts. But you would be quite remiss if you didn't notice a final point. That vision, Nan Metwaly was a mother of 4 living in Egypt, unhappy in her marriage, a person of ill temper and ill humor, an intolerant person, a grumpy person, an unhappy person. And then she falls ill. And she thinks, this is it. This is my entire miserable life. And the vision she has is of a very attractive man. And the very attractive man, not a Mediterranean-looking man, not a Palestinian-looking man, not a Jewish-looking man, but of a blue-eyed white man. And the blue-eyed white man picks her and makes her very special and tells her, come to me. Nahid Metwaly now says this vision was from Shaitan. But back then, it is this happiness and hubris that she felt that was enough to sustain her for 30 years of bashing the religion of Islam. Pause. Think about our world. We are consistently told that we live in a post-religious world. But do we? That we live in societies that are committed to secularism, that are entirely neutral towards religious creeds. But are they? Look in this most fascinating narrative, how the colonial links with the racial, links with gender issues, links with empowerment and disempowerment. Reflect and think how a person who had not read the Bible once managed to mislead, as I said, scores of Muslims away from the religion and fill them with doubt. But for me, the most important lesson about this entire thing is something even more mundane. So obvious, it's nearly embarrassing to talk about. In fact, irritating, annoying. Yes, all types of countries gave Nahid Metwaly visas. Yes, Nahid Metwaly was invited by organizations that knew governors and mayors and congressmen and senators, that facilitated meetings and cocktail parties and celebrations and events. Yes, Nahid Metwaly was given institutional asylum, legal asylum, and that required an act of state. But think about what really sustained Nahid Metwaly for 30 years. Think about what enabled Nahid Metwaly to put her name on 20 books. Books that you cannot imagine if you haven't read. Books, one of them, the one that I just talked about, has no less than 1,000 citations. and requires a great deal of learning to sit there and say, you're making stuff up. You have no idea what you're talking about. Shall we just say it? What funded Nahid Metwaly for 30 years, what enables Nahid Metwaly to have financial security to our very day, what funded the research of these books, the writing of these books, the publication of these books, the distribution of these books, what funded the television programs, the hundreds and thousands of television programs that Nahid Metwaly appeared on, the hundreds and thousands of journals and publications that interviewed Nahid Metwaly in the days of her Islam bashing, was private money. Was private money. It was devout. We can have a debate as whether they're real devout or they don't understand devotion and they don't understand what it means to be religious. But purportedly devout Christians and devout Zionists who thought Nahid Metwaly served their agenda, who had a sworn, embedded, vested interests in proselytizing and converting Muslims. And they were going to convert them even if it was through lies and inventions and fabrications. But in order to serve the cause they believed in, they donated thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dollars. These television stations that are running to our very day, that are broadcasting anti-Islamic context 24 hours a day, are funded by private money. All the royalties and fees and honorariums, some of them as heavy as $20,000 per lecture, it's private money, donor money. Devout Christians and devout Jews that believe in whatever their cause is. Now, this money is doing a very good job maligning Nahid Metwaly, burying this 80-year-old woman in rumors of insanity and craziness. Literally, the invention of a non-existing medical record of mental instability and psychological illnesses, because money can even buy that. And Nahid Metwaly knows that sadly, the best of Muslims are the poorest of Muslims. And that Muslims who can help her are Muslims who are living under oppression, poverty, need, instability. And she knows that the truth of the matter is Christians are a generous people. Jews are a generous people. Hindus are a generous people. Muslims are not. Muslims are a stingy people. And although Allah said in Surah Al-Hadid, spend from what Allah has put you in trust over that this money that you think is yours is simply a trust left with you by God. And although Allah said that explicitly, all these people who are supposedly literalists, who will raise high hell because a woman is not wearing hijab, because they're literalists, that's what they claim. They'll come to Surah Al-Hadid and a verse like this, and suddenly they're not literalists anymore. And suddenly they'll start to, we have to understand it in context, you have to understand the purpose, you have to look at the deeper meaning, you have to this, you have to that. The smell and stench of hypocrisy, the stench of ineptitude. Story like Metwaly's testifies so loudly as to why we Muslims are where we are. In the experience I've had in this world, a world that I cannot seem to be at peace with. I have to tell you, I have nothing but feelings of disdain for wealthy Muslims. Time and again, when I've encountered wealthy Muslims, I found them to be literally a paragon of shirk, a paragon of what it means to worship idols, but this time the idols are within the self. To see themselves as awsiya, as somehow the caretakers over scholarship, over scholars, over thought, over piety. They think of themselves as mini gods. And what made them mini gods is their money. Money that they are not generous with, and that they will spend only with millions of strings attached. And all the strings lead to self-aggrandizement and self-promotion. They must be recognized as the true authorities in the world. Otherwise, they will not even extend the literal money that they do extend. Let me want to be very clear about this. Think of just one of the books that were published with Metwaly's name on them. Think of how many people you need to hire to compose a book like this, to put together a book like this. You can't have doctors or lawyers doing it in their free time. You need to hire people who are full-time committed to writing fabrications about Islam, and who are so good at their job that their fabrications have to appear like truth. So if they make simple grammar mistakes, it's not good enough. If they conjugate in the wrong way, it's not good enough. Then after they write this, think of how much money it will take to publish. And think of the type of financial network is necessary to tell Nahid Metwaly, come put your name on this so we can publish it and distribute it and know that they will not get any financial return back. Think of all the money that was spent paying for Nahid Metwaly's gas, her fuel. In all the planes, I sat imagining how much fuel was consumed flying Nahid Metwaly all over the world for 30 years to bash Islam. Who paid for this fuel? Who paid for her food? Who paid for her residence? Who paid for her kids' education? Who paid for everything? Who makes Hershey Ali wealthy? Who makes Wafa Sultan wealthy? Who makes Noni Darwish wealthy? Why are we the way we are? Why? Time and time again, I forced myself, tried to sufficiently flatter wealthy Muslims to get them to do what God obligates them to do. And time again, you discover that in the world of Islam, wealthy Muslims want their money to earn them uninterrupted praise and uninterrupted or unmitigated aggrandizement. All money should lead to the elevation of their self. And if they see that this is not going to happen, you know the results. Allah told us repeatedly to reflect upon the sunnah of the Kawn, the narratives of stories that surround us every day, but not to look at them for entertainment, but as lessons as to the nature of the world we live in. As an academic reaching the end of my days on this earth, it saddens me to admit that Nahid Metwaly, in her days of Islamophobia, is 1,000,000 times more effective than Khalid Abul Fadl at his very height. But there is a network of support that makes the Islamophobic Nahid Metwaly so effective, and a complete lack of network that makes Khalid Abul Fadl so ineffective. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم أسأل الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على الحبيب المصطفى محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Told you that so much news, so many things. That it is hard to even decide what to focus on. But again, often what draws me are the micro events. They are like the little break in the curtain that allows a focused ray of sun to enter the room. And in this focused ray of sun that enters the room through the cracked curtains, you can see the dust particles flying in the air. And often you can really see how dusty the place that you are in is. It is often these micro stories that tell you so much. One of these stories, my own alma mater, in a most distinguished school, Princeton University. At Princeton University, there is a fairly young academic professor, Professor Satya Larsen. Professor Satya Larsen teaches at Princeton, and she posted her syllabus for a course that she's teaching in the fall term that, as all of us know, is about to start for schools on a semester system. And Satya Larsen, in the school that teaches students critical thought, analytical thinking, that is committed or dedicated to the study of decolonization and the post-colonial world and what it means to live in a post-colonial world. In that course, among the texts that she assigned is, of course, Edward Said's Orientalism, Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, a brilliant book called Colonial Trauma by Karim al-Ghazali, and a book that has gotten enormous attention in the academic world because of its dazzling brilliance, by Jasbir Puar, called The Right to Maim: Debility, Capacity, Disability. And Jasbir Puar's book talks about how the state can use the disabling of the body as a part of a communicative structure for domination and control. What she focuses on in Puar's book is how the Israeli state intentionally created a generation of maimed Palestinian people to send a very effective psychological message of the futility of resistance to occupation, that your broken bodies is part of your broken world, that unless you fully submit to us, you have no prayer of ever mending. What's amazing is that Zionist organizations, including the Center for Jewish Life at Princeton, on the Princeton campus, raised hell against that Princeton professor, Satya Larson, demanding that Princeton University ban the book by Jasper Poir, The Right to Maim. They had, in fact, two demands. One demand is that the provost cancel the class altogether, Satya Larson's class. Tell her, you can't teach this class. If not, then at a minimum, that Satya Larson would be ordered to not teach this book, The Right to Maim. Now, there was a petition signed by some 250 people, most of them academics, supporting Professor Satya Larson and her right to teach whatever text she deems appropriate. In fact, a prominent Jewish organization at Princeton that has signed a letter of a couple of hundred undergraduate and graduate Jewish students at Princeton, signed a letter supporting Professor Satya Larson and supporting her right to teach whatever she deems appropriate. And as far as I know, the controversy is still ongoing. But I'll tell you what happens in the academic world. Whether you forced the professor to remove this book or not is really a very small part of the game. What is a big part of the game is that you've sent a message to Princeton University and to all esteemed universities around the United States and indeed United States, Canada, and Europe, that this professor, Satya Larson, is problematic. That if you're going to promote this professor, if you're going to appoint this professor to important committee appointments, if you're going to put this professor in any position of authority and influence, you better think twice, you better think thrice, you better think again and again, because this is a marked professor. Second, you've sent a message to numerous graduate students. You better think again and again before you pursue your graduate studies with this professor, because a recommendation from this professor might be hurtful in the job market. Moreover, you've sent a message to all types of students that this professor is more like engages in intellectual wizardry, not real academic analysis. That this is someone to be on guard with, someone to avoid, someone not to take classes with, because they play magic with analysis and thought, and they might corrupt your thinking and destroy your ability to become mobile and effective in a capitalist society. Even more, you've sent a message throughout the United States. If you are a professor and you have a course and you are thinking of assigning the right to maim, you better think very carefully, because maybe a place like Princeton will tell the professor, you can assign whatever you want, we will not intervene. But think about whether your school can afford such a principled position. If you assign this book and you get into trouble, are you sure that you are in a school that will actually support your right? Now listen, I don't need to point out for the millionth time the absolute hypocrisy that these are the very same people that point at Muslims and say Muslims don't understand freedom of speech and don't have liberal values because they have a problem with the Satanic verses and Salman Rushdie. And the same breath, these very same organizations will do something like this. But I have a deeper point and a more serious point, and a point that sadly, the minute I say deeper and serious, I start thinking to myself, how many of my people will even understand or care? What Professor Satya Larson is doing in her course is teaching a mode of thinking, a mode of analysis that interrogates power. Larson, by assigning books by Edward Said, Fanon, by Karima Lazali, she is assigning texts that teach students how to think very critically about hegemony and power structures and oppression, and how our modern world institutionalizes structurally and culturally the mechanics of oppression, and to teach critical students how to expose the institutions of power and oppression. The irony of all ironies. That at the same time that Zionist organizations, at least the Zionist organizations that are fanatic enough to do this, point at this type of narrative, at the scholarship of people like Fanon or Edward Said or Jasper Puar, who is, by the way, a highly respected professor at Rutgers. At the same time that Zionist organizations look at Jasper Puar, that professor at Rutgers, and absolutely detest and want to erase such academics off the face of the earth, who shares with them that same agenda? Yes, the right wing, the same right-wingers that try to ban critical studies, critical thought, critical cultural thought in various institutions. The same white establishment that says rule of law means respecting hierarchy and the existing power structure, and that you must accept your position in this hierarchy. And if you want to change your position in this hierarchy, then you must play by the rules, albeit we are the ones that set these rules. The existing power structure is the one that set the rules. So now, the world that people like Jasper Puar is challenging is a world in which the colonial masters, the white racial masters, the capitalist masters have drawn the rules of the game. And pair these rules, they always come on top. And if you want a part of the prize, you have to play by their rules. In the same time, do you know who else supports them? Yes, your Muslim brethren. I don't mean the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean your fellow Muslims at places like Zaytuna, university or school, who tell you that this hierarchy, respecting this hierarchy, living by this hierarchy, is respecting the rule of law and is living in dignity. That dignity requires you to put aside critical thought, put aside an Edward Said, put aside Frantz Fanon, put aside Karim al-Ghazali, put aside Jasper Puar, put aside this whole world that teaches you to question power and to challenge power and tells you what God wants and what dignity mandates is that you accept your position in life. And if your position in life is an oppressed minority, is an oppressed non-white, then the problem is your false consciousness, because you're not really oppressed. That's just a narrative of victimization. And narratives of victimization is contrary to dignity. Who gets the financial support in the world we live in? Yes. It is these folks that tell you there is dignity in accepting oppression. These are the people that find Muslim donors supporting them. How about the Muslims who tell you there is no dignity in living an oppressed life. There is no dignity in an unjust law. There is no dignity in a rule of law that masks the rule of oppressors and the rule of racism. How about those people? You can guess the answer. So much to talk about. So many events that I could have dealt with. But we'll have to stop here for today. And maybe in another khutbah, I'll deal with these issues. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم إني داع فأمنوا اللهم اغفر لنا اللهم ارحمنا يا رحمن يا رحيم اللهم تب علينا يا تواب واهدنا لأقرب من هذا رشدا يا رحمن يا رحيم. Allah forgive our sins. Allah empower us to be better Muslims. Empower us to stand by what is right, to be bearers of the true message, to bring light and goodness and beauty to our world. وصلي وسلم وبارك على محمد وآله وأصحابه وأقم الصلاة.